From the earliest days of Scouting America, various programs have been developed and designed to retain older youth and provide them with interesting opportunities for engagement, advancement, and achievement. The term senior scouting has been used as the generic identification for these programs. Among the many variants have been Sea Scouts, Explorer Scouts, Air Scouts, Rover Scouts, and Explorers of many types. The senior scouting program with the longest tenure is Sea Scouting, which has also gone by the name of Sea Scouts and Sea Exploring at various times. We'll learn more about the history of Sea Scouting in this edition of Artifact of the Week. Brownsea Island is well known as the camp where Baden-Powell tested out his ideas for scouting. However, the boys who participated at Brownsea in 1907 were not scouts in the normal sense of the word. As the camp was an experiment predating the scouting movement, these boys did not belong to any recognized scout group. The second camp BP put on followed the publication of Scouting for Boys and occurred from August 22nd through September 4th, 1908 at Humself. At this camp, the participants were actual scouts who benefited from the lessons found in the 6 issues of Scouting for Boys to help guide their adventures. While thousands of scouts would have wanted to participate in this camp, attendance was limited to 30 scouts, with all expenses being paid by Pearson, the publisher of Scouting for Boys, as well as a youth magazine called The Scout. In the first issue of The Scout, the publisher announced a contest, with the prize being an invitation to attend the camp at Humself. To win, you had to be one of the top 30 scouts who collected the most votes and were listed in the issue published just before the week of camp. Voting coupons were provided in each issue of the magazine. The top vote getter was a scout named F.D. Watson with over 29,000 votes to his credit. Following the success of the camp at Humself, a second contest, this time for 100 scouts, was set up to be held from July 24th through August 7th, 1909. But this time the campsite would be on a boat or a ship. It would give BP an opportunity to test his scouting program in a water environment as opposed to the camping and woods environment of the first 2 camps. It is reported that BP also saw this as an opportunity to recruit boys to the idea of scouting in an environment where they were already invested and interested. Later, BP wrote, "Sea Scouting is not necessarily a scheme for turning out a boy as ready-made sailor with a view to his going to sea, but rather to teach him by means which attract him to be handy, quick, and disciplined man, able to look after himself and to help others in danger." The location of this third camp was a training ship, the schooner T.S. Mercury, docked on the Belleau River. The one downside to the Mercury is that it could only accommodate 50 scouts, and the contest was for 100 participants. To solve this problem, BP reached out to Lord Montague of Belleau for permission to camp on his grounds adjacent to where the Mercury was moored. Lord Montague agreed to allow the scouts to camp at the Buckler's Hard Site, a location that is steeped in naval history. For the time at camp, 50 boys camped on land for 1 week and then swapped with the boys on the Mercury for the second week. This ship-based camp was also a success and proved that the scouting program could be delivered either on land or on the water. The stage for sea scouting was set. To get the program started, BP published a booklet for organizers and scoutmasters called Sea Scouting for Boys. Much like Scouting for Boys, the booklet details the Sea Scouting program and how the training scheme could be carried out. In 1912, BP asked his older brother Warrington, an accomplished and experienced merchant mariner and sailing canoe inventor, to write the manual for sea scouting called Sea Scouting and Seamanship for Boys. Warrington worked with Lord Charles Beresford, the first chief Sea Scout, to develop the training scheme found in the manual. Sea Scouting was born. Meanwhile, on this side of the pond, 2 men can arguably be seen as the founders of Sea Scouts within the BSA. In 1912, Arthur A. Carey of Boston, Massachusetts, used his schooner Pioneer to help establish Sea Scouts in the United States. That year, Carey was appointed the chairman of the National Council Committee on Sea Scouting. The second individual was Charles Longstreet of Philadelphia. During the summer of 1912, he organized a patrol of Sea Scouts on his yacht. In taking up nautical scouting in Philadelphia, I have found that it is not always possible to have the ideal equipment, but that a great deal may be done with small boats. To my mind, the ideal equipment would be made up of small units of, say, jib and mainsail sailing boats of about 30 feet waterline of ample beam and drawing about 4 feet of water. These boats should be fitted with watertight cockpits and be practically non-capsizable and non-sinkable. They would cost about $800. With covering over the main boom and cockpit and an alcohol stove fitted up, about 6 boys could sleep and eat on board. 3 such boats and one 30-foot motorboat as a tender could cruise as a squadron. We've issued 2 general orders containing regulations and tentative plans for instructions and cruises. The boys must be second or first class scouts in Philadelphia troops and will be required to pass seamanship tests within 1 year of enlistment. This year, the first meeting at the Philadelphia headquarters included examination and instruction in seamanship, rules of the road, and man overboard and fire drills. In May, we held an examination and inspected the equipment. The first actual practice will come in June, when we will have a day cruise on the R12 with chart work, lead line, anchoring, rowing, etc. On July 7th, the annual cruise will be held in Barnegat Bay. The squadron will consist of the flagship with 3 scouts on board as a signalman and quartermaster, and 3 dories with a crew of 5 each in charge of a quartermaster. The cruise will end July 14th, and after disabandonment, the scouts who acted as cooks and mess stewards will be taken on the Arwen to New York and Long Island Sound. Carrie prepared a pamphlet called Cruising for Sea Scouts, which is recognized as the first official publication related to sea scouting in the BSA. In a report to the National Executive Board, Mr. Carey recommended that sea scouting be recognized as a special department of the Boy Scouts of America. He suggested that the pamphlet Cruising for Sea Scouts be accepted as a supplement to the Handbook for Boys until a more complete Sea Scout manual could be written. All Scout officials, and especially those living near the water, will be interested in the steps which have been taken for the development of a sea or water branch of Scouting. As yet, a definite name has not been decided upon for this Scout division. The work has been successfully conducted in England and other Scout centers. For the past 2 years, through the interest of Mr. Arthur A. Carey of Waltham, Mass., the schooner Pioneer has been used for sea scouting experience. Mr. Carey, who is chairman of the committee representing the National Council on Sea Scouting in this country, has compiled a booklet based upon his experience. He has generously agreed to provide this office with copies for free distribution to those who are especially interested. In 1915, Charles Longstreet published his book called Nautical Scouting, which gave some much-needed direction to the Sea Scout program. It was reported in the June 1st issue of Scouting magazine, National Headquarters takes great pleasure in announcing the completion of the Handbook on Nautical Scouting, which has recently been completed by Mr. Charles Longstreet of Philadelphia, chairman of the Nautical Scouting of the National Council of the Boy Scouts of America. A supply of these books is now on sale at National Headquarters at a price of 25 cents each. This handbook has been prepared to conform with the new policy of the Boy Scouts of America in regard to nautical troops. In the past, the work of nautical scouts was confined almost exclusively to large boats, which necessarily made the work rather expensive and shut out from its enjoyment those scouts who did not live on the seaboard or near other large bodies of water. In order to make the program of nautical scouting available for a much larger number of boys, the requirements have been adopted to suit conditions on small rivers and streams. This will make it possible for inland scouts, who happen to live anywhere near a lake or stream, to carry on the Nautical Scout program. To become a Sea Scout, a scout had to be 15 years of age, subscribe to the Scout Oath and Law, pass the requirements for tenderfoot, and weigh at least 112 pounds. In an article in the June 1913 issue of Scouting magazine, James Wilder, the Scout Commissioner in Hawaii, reported, "Our scouts now number 175 as against about 30 a year ago and 85 to 97 in my last reports. I have organized the Sea Scout Patrol. The first boat's crew began work May 8th in a cutter lent them by Rear Admiral Moore, Commandant of the Naval Station here, and under First Sergeant Ralph, an experienced man in boat drill, and Mr. Wood, a clever yachtsman, now inspector at the Naval Dry Dock at Pearl Harbor." James Wilder, who was known as Chemo, was a veteran sailor, global traveler, artist, and as I just mentioned, a BSA commissioner in Hawaii. Wilder also created the Pine Tree Patrol and wrote the manual for this regimented system of patrol organization for the most efficient method of camping. In 1917, Wilder was named the director of the Department of Sea Scouting. In 1919, he supervised the preparation of the first Sea Scout manual and transformed the uniform away from the standard BSA uniform to a unique Sea Scout uniform with the jumper, pants, and leggings khaki in color, with navy blue collar, pocket flaps, wristbands, and insignia. For several years as a volunteer, Wilder served as the Chief Sea Scout. In 1922, Commander Thomas Keane took over leadership of the Sea Scout program. He wrote the new requirements for advancement and introduced the blue and white naval-style uniforms. He also completely revised the Sea Scout manual, which was released in 1924. In 1927, as a result of his fine leadership, he was appointed the National Director of Sea Scouting, becoming its first full-time professional director. One of his earliest projects was organizing the first Antarctic expedition to include a scout. This is the 1928-29 Admiral Byrd expedition, where Eagle Scout and Able Sea Scout Paul Seipel was selected to go on to Antarctica as an official representative of the BSA. During the 1930s, membership grew to about 8,000 Sea Scouts. New training courses for leaders, new registration procedures, and more acceptable Sea Scout equipment and uniforms were also developed during this time frame. In the 1940s, membership grew to over 27,000 Sea Scouts. Commander Keane was recalled to active duty service in the Navy during the war and resigned from his position as National Director of Sea Scouting. Thousands upon thousands of former and active Sea Scouts joined the Navy and made a tremendous impression on Admiral Chester Nimitz, who sincerely believed that Sea Scouts were better trained and better equipped to help the Navy win out over the enemy and the elements. On September 1, 1949, the Sea Scouts officially became Sea Explorers. Despite the name change, the program remained largely the same as it had been in the past. On January 1, 1959, a completely new Explorer program, including sea exploring, was launched following a 1954 research study of the needs, desires, and concerns of 14 to 16-year-old boys across the nation. By May of 1964, the revised sea exploring program was fully implemented, with a new edition of the Sea Exploring Manual being released. In 1968, a new exploring division and a new National Sea Exploring Committee were organized, with a renewed volunteer emphasis on sea exploring, including the promotion and support for the program. In 1972, Sea Exploring became the first BSA program to become fully co-ed, followed by the rest of the exploring program that same year. In 1974, the U.S. Navy assigned a liaison officer to work at the BSA National Office. This cooperative arrangement would last through 1983. Technological improvements in seamanship, extensive changes to aids in navigation, and internal program improvements brought about the need for a new sea exploring manual, which was developed by several BSA skippers, U.S. Coast Guard personnel, and maritime experts. In 1998, the BSA reorganized the exploring program into the Learning for Life exploring program and the new Venturing Division. Sea Exploring was placed in the Venturing Division and was renamed Sea Scouts. 2 years later, the 10th edition of the Sea Scout Manual was released, along with updated advancement and uniforming standards. This manual would last for 10 years before the 11th edition was published. Sea Scouting celebrated 100 years of seamanship, scouting, and service in 2012. At least 40 events were held around the country to celebrate this anniversary. 2012 also marked the introduction of the new Century uniform, now known as the official Sea Scout uniform. This was the first major change to the Sea Scout uniform since Thomas Keane standardized it in the 1920s. In February 2016, the National Executive Board of the BSA established Sea Scouting as a full-fledged program of the BSA, on par with Cub Scouting, Scouts BSA, and Venturing. They also released the 12th edition of the Sea Scout Manual, featuring a major overhaul in advancement requirements and a paddle sports program that was added. The United States Coast Guard Auxiliary named Sea Scouting as their official youth program in 2018, bringing Sea Scouting to the forefront of the maritime industry in the United States. On display here at the National Scouting Museum, we have two exhibits. The first is the Scouting Heritage Gallery, where Scouts can read about the history of sea scouting and see samples of the original 1915 edition of Nautical Scouting, the first edition of the Sea Scout Manual from 1920, and early editions of the Handbook for Skippers. There is also a selection of Sea Scout insignia worn by both youth and adults throughout the program's history. Another part of the display tells about the Sea Scout Quartermaster Award, which was introduced in 1930. During this award, a Sea Scout had to first qualify for the ranks of apprentice, ordinary, and able seaman. Sea Scouts were also allowed to wear a special Eagle Scout cloth badge on their white or blue Sea Scout uniforms. This white jumper on display belonged to Sea Scout Eagle Scout Paul Fluck of Algoma, Wisconsin. Fluck was a charter member of Sea Scout ship LaSalle, established in 1936. He earned his Eagle Scout rank in 1934 at the age of 15. The second display is a case found in the Villa Terrace dining room at the Philmont Training Center. In this display, you will find samples of the Sea Scout's blue uniform as well as the dress jacket. While this jumper resembles the U.S. Navy jumper, there are a couple of differences that you will note. On the Navy jumper, you will find 3 stripes on the collar and cuffs, whereas the Sea Scout jumper only has 2. Also on the back of the collar, the Navy jumper has stars and the Sea Scout jumper has BSA insignia. This jumper was worn by a Sea Scout who served as its ship's bosun or patrol leader and yeoman or scribe. There are also 3 Sea Scout hats on display. 2 of these are seaman's hats and 1 is a skipper's hat. You will also find a homemade sextant, a device used in navigation. The sextant was developed in the early 1700s. A homemade psychometer, which is a device used to measure temperature and relative humidity, and a bosun's pipe, which is used to communicate orders and commands on a ship. This particular bosun's pipe originated from the USS Constitution and was gifted to BSA President Irving Feast by Admiral Joseph Wiley in the 1970s. Finally, the Sea Scout emblem. The first-class anchor has been used in the Sea Scouting program for over 90 years. The key component of the first-class anchor is the fleur-de-lis. The 3 points signify the 3 parts of the Scout Oath: duty to God and to country, duty to others, and duty to self. Like a compass, the center point always points north, symbolizing a true course in life. The eagle with the shield is the national emblem of the United States of America, and it represents freedom. The scroll with the motto represents a Scout's smile and reminds us to be prepared. The knot attached to the bottom of the scroll reminds each Sea Scout that they have promised to do a good turn daily. The stars beneath the eagle's wings symbolize the ideals of truth and knowledge as guides in the night sky for finding our way. They reflect our nautical life and suggest a Scout's outdoor adventures. The anchor symbolizes Sea Scout's maritime heritage. Today, Sea Scout programming focuses on 3 major activity tracks. Recreational boating teaches Scouts basic seamanship skills that they can take with them into their lives beyond Scouting America. The Marine Industry track focuses on possible careers in the merchant marine along with related skills. The Military Service track focuses on leadership and seamanship skills necessary to gain a head start for a Navy or Coast Guard career. All 3 tracks allow Scouts to become certified in categories such as scuba diving, boating safety, life saving, and CPR. As of the fall of 2024, Sea Scouts had approximately 3,500 Scouts and 3,200 adults registered to 336 ships. That's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of Scouting America through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact